Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's filtered webinar, VLOOKUP, Excel's most dangerous feature. The webinar will be led by course author and former chairman of the ICAW IT faculty, Simon Hurst. Before we pass the controls over to Simon, just a few quick bits of housekeeping. Firstly, if you are new to Filtered, we're an online training provider specialising in the use of technology to personalise content, accelerating learning and reducing training time. Check out filtered.com to see our range of courses which can train your staff in key business and software skills. Follow us on Twitter with #FilteredWebinar to get updates, feedback about webinars, or send us any questions you have. If you've got any questions during the webinar for Simon, please submit them by the chat pane in GoToWebinar. We'll be fielding them at the end of the session. Yeah, just put them in as we go, and we'll ask Simon at the end. Depending on how many we receive, we may not be able to field all of them, so if we don't get around to answering yours, please do email us at hello@filtered.com after the webinar and we'll get back to you with the answers. That's everything from me, so it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Simon for the webinar. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you all for being there.
Muted.
If you've given up watching the World 2020 semi-final just to attend a webinar on VLOOKUP. So we're going to be looking at Excel's lookup functions, VLOOKUP in particular. We're going to look at the good things that VLOOKUP can do, but also how easily it can go wrong. And then we're going to look at some of the functions that can do more than VLOOKUP can do, can be used where VLOOKUP doesn't provide a complete solution, before going on to a fairly radically different way of doing lookups within Excel. So we'll get the bad news out of the way first. We'll look at the dangers of VLOOKUP. And here we've got a little table down here with countries and IDs and the flags that go with and we've used our list of countries to provide the data validation drop-down source for our and then in cell B4 we're using a VLOOKUP function to look at our country name in cell A4, compare it to our list of countries and bringing the corresponding value from column 2. So we should find when we choose, for example, Korea North, that the number 2 appears. It will find Korea North in our list and bring in the value on the same row from column 2. So let's see if that works. So currently we're looking at Finland. If we choose North Korea, we can see indeed shows us the number 2 and the appropriate flag for North Korea. Let's just go through the others and see that it works for all of them. Switzerland, fine. USA, fine. South Korea, not fine. You can see here that for South Korea, rather than matching number 5, it's matched North Korea and brought in the flag for North Korea rather than South Korea. And that, in essence, is what can easily go wrong with VLOOKUP. And the reason it's done what it's done is because of the 4th argument of VLOOKUP. If we look at our VLOOKUP function, we can see we've used 3 arguments. We've got our lookup value, we've got the table that we're comparing it against, compare it against the left-hand column of this table, and we've got the column index number, which column from our table do we want to return the answer from. But we haven't used the 4th argument, the range lookup argument. If we add a comma to enter our 4th argument, we'll see that our choices are true for an approximate match and false for an exact match. If we don't enter the 4th argument, as we didn't here, it will use the approximate match as the default. So if you don't enter anything for the 4th argument, it will perform an approximate match. And I think the misapprehension is that an approximate match will find the closest item to what you're looking for. But that's not actually how the approximate match in VLOOKUP works. As we've seen here with Korea South and Korea North, sort of intuitively we'd probably reckon that the closest thing to Korea South was probably Korea South, but clearly that didn't quite work there. So in order for this to work properly, we'd have to make sure we use the fourth argument. So if we double click on false to use the fourth argument, we should now find that any of our selections now work. So Finland number 1, North Korea number 2, Switzerland number 3, USA number 4, and South Korea, if I can actually click it, South Korea number 5, the correct flag. So we've made it work by adding in the fourth argument and making it an exact match. There would be another way to do this if there was a match for the entry we're making. We could sort our records in ascending order. So if we were to sort A to Z and go back to our VLOOKUP and use the true value or leave it out altogether, we should see, because we've sorted, again, all of them should work. You can see they're all bringing up the correct flag. So the one thing you must never do with VLOOKUP is to either use true as the fourth argument or to omit the fourth argument and try and work with a table where the left-hand column isn't sorted in ascending order. If you do that, as we saw originally, you'll get what can look like a completely random answer. So that's probably the main danger of VLOOKUP. It's not the only danger of VLOOKUP. One of the issues with VLOOKUP is if we want to take our code, compare it against our nominal ledger, find out which category that code belongs to. So here we've used a VLOOKUP, and the VLOOKUP compares our value in A6 against our table here, and it looks for the second value, the second column, the category, and works fine. But if we were to insert a column, so if I insert a column here, column 2 is now blank, VLOOKUP still looks for column 2, no reason it should change, and it now returns the results from a blank column, or it could, if you shuffled your columns around, be a completely different column. So VLOOKUP is very dependent on your columns staying in the right order. Now in a minute we're going to go and have a look at match, but just as a quick taster of that, this is, you might have noticed that match did cope with the insertion of the additional column, and we can see here that we're using match to match our column heading as well as our actual value, which is why match still worked, and we'll see that in detail in a minute. Before we do, let's have a look at the approximate form of VLOOKUP. You might be thinking, given that VLOOKUP is so dangerous in that if you forget that fourth argument and your column isn't sorted, you get completely the wrong answer. Why on earth did Microsoft decide to have this approximate form of VLOOKUP? And indeed, what does this approximate form of VLOOKUP do? Well, there is a very good reason for having the approximate form of VLOOKUP, and this is an example of that here. So the idea here is maybe we've got some sort of code and amount. This could be an accounting system, nominal ledger. It could be sort of invoice codes and values or whatever. And in order to produce some sort of report, we might want to summarize our values according to our codes. Now, what we wouldn't want to do is just to do it by doing a cell range. So we wouldn't want to do sales as being equal to B6 to B23, because if we were then to insert some additional sales codes, our value might no longer use the right cells. So if we added them underneath the B23, they wouldn't be included in that range. Similarly, if this was an external data range that can be refreshed and different values being brought in, then the actual range of cells for each of these categories would change quite a bit from month to month. So it'd be much more reliable, much more automatic if we could create our subtotals based on the code. Now, clearly it's quite easy to match 0 with 0 and 100 with 100. The difficulty comes in that we need to match all codes from 0 to 99 with the category sales and all codes from 100 to 199 with the category cost of sales. And this is what VLOOKUP does. So if we look at VLOOKUP, so at the moment we're using this approximate form of VLOOKUP. We have true as the fourth argument. Let me just change that to what we were looking at before. So if I put false in here, and then you'll see that that does what it's told. It only makes a match where there is an exact match, and where there isn't an exact match, so code 1, there is no code 1 in our table, it just says there's no match available. So let's just use Control Z to go back to the approximate form. And what the approximate form does is it looks for the highest value in the table that is smaller than or equal to the value you're searching for. So in the case of 0, the highest value in our table that is less than or equal to 0 is 0. But that's also true of 1. The highest value in our table that is less than or equal to 1 is still 0. All the way up to 99, the highest value in our table that is less than or equal to 99 is still 0. And you can see, because of the way that works, why this has to be sorted in ascending order, and why that if you're doing in being in ascending order, you can get a random answer. So this works perfectly in this example. It brings the category sales for all of our codes from 0 to 99, cost of sales, everything from 100 to 199, and so on through our nominal ledger. So we could then quite easily use maybe a sum ifs function, something like that, to say that we want to add up our amounts and enter our criteria. So we want to compare our criteria range and we'll look at our criteria, and that should enable us to create a summary, and that summary should change automatically if the codes change. So that's why there's an approximate form of VLOOKUP and why it can be useful. But if in doubt, always use the exact form of VLOOKUP. There is another reason why you might want to use the approximate form of VLOOKUP rather than the exact form. Again, you need to be careful, and that's to do with speed. We'll have a look at this separate workbook. This will take a minute or two to open, because what I've done in this workbook is to use every single row in a sheet to enter some information about some invoices. So we've got, you'll see in a minute, you've got some invoice IDs, you've got some invoice values, and then I've got 1,000 cells that use VLOOKUP to find the value for a particular invoice ID. So here we've got our IDs. Let's start with the exact one. So we go to the exact one, and if we just go down to the bottom, control down arrow to go down to the bottom of our list, you'll see it goes all the way down to the bottom of our sheet. And what I've got up here are 3 values from my ID column, and I've put the row that those values are on. This value is on row 3, this value on row 500,000, this value on row 1,000,000 plus, and over here we're using VLOOKUP, the exact form of VLOOKUP, to find our value in our table. Now the speed depends on where the value is. So for this value, which is right at the top of our table, it will be almost instant. So if we copy that, paste it into the cell and then copy it down. There's 1,000 rows here. So copy it down those 1,000 rows, you'll see that that recalculates almost instantly. Now, fortunately, I've got a trained observer here with an extremely accurate timing device, and we're going to now time to 100th of a second the value, or the time it's going to take to recalculate, where we use the value in the 500,000th row. So if you'd like to start the timing machine, we can see it calculating down here. I will call out stop. When it finishes, stop. And apparently that was 6.37 seconds. We'll now look at the value right down the bottom. And we're going to time this as well. Obviously a bit longer, and stop, and 12.72. So we can see that the time taken to perform the calculation is proportional to whereabouts in our list the value is. And obviously this is only relevant if you've got lots and lots and lots of VLOOKUPs, but you could see that it could make your spreadsheet much slower using a VLOOKUP in this way. So let's look at exactly the same approach, but where we use an approximate lookup. And in order to use an approximate lookup, as we've discussed, we have to sort our column in ascending order, which is what we've done here. The other thing to think about is that if we do an exact match and there is no exact match, Excel will report an error, so we know that a match hasn't been found, whereas if we do an approximate match, it will just find the nearest one based on the largest values smaller than or equal to. So you might need to deal with the possibility that there's no match. But let's just have a look at the speed. So we'll start off with the one right at the top, and we'll find that that is, again, pretty much instant. Now we'll go to the one that's on row 640,000. And you'll see it's still pretty much instant, and we'll go to the one right at the bottom. And again, pretty much instant. So VLOOKUP is vastly quicker using the approximate form than it is using the exact form. So having looked at VLOOKUP, as promised, we're going to look at some of the other lookups. We'll just start simply enough with HLOOKUP. So HLOOKUP is just VLOOKUP but transposed. So whereas VLOOKUP looks down a column, finds a match, and brings in a value from the same row in a different column, HLOOKUP looks along a row, finds a match, and brings in a value from a different row in the same column. So in this example here, we've got the dates where a particular tax rate, this is the VAT rate in the UK, for example, a date where a particular tax rate came into force. We've got a series of dates, and we're using HLOOKUP in its approximate form, just like VLOOKUP. It has an exact and an approximate form. We're using the approximate form to find out which VAT rate is used for a particular date. So just like with the approximate form of VLOOKUP, we're looking for the greatest, highest value in our table that is less than or equal to our date. So it's the item in our table either equal to or before our date, that will be the VAT rate that was in use at the date of our invoice. So that's HLOOKUP, exactly the same as VLOOKUP, but transposing the rows and columns. So now let's move on to match and index and seeing how we can extend what lookups can do using match and index. So what we've got here is a table with columns, and we want to find the intersection of a particular row and a particular column. So for example, if we want the figure for January for the UK, we want to be able to type those in and have our formula find the intersection. Now, we can't do that with VLOOKUP because with VLOOKUP we just have to hard code the column reference or the row reference if we're using HLOOKUP, but we can do it using match. So if I just go down here and we'll just look at the match element of this in isolation. So let's look at how we find the match for Jan. So we'll do equals match, and the value we want to look up is Jan, and we want to look it up in our table here. Now we're including the blank row, or sorry, the blank cell in the corner of our table for reasons that will hopefully become obvious. And we want an exact match. So like VLOOKUP, we have an exact match, but unlike VLOOKUP, as well as the largest value less than or equal to, with match we can have the smallest item greater than or equal to, so more flexibility there. We'll go for an exact match, as we've said, and that tells us, doesn't give us the value, it just tells us that Jan is the second item in that block of 4 cells. Exactly the same for the UK, equals match. We want to look up the value UK. This time I think it's called a vector, that is our column here, again including the blank cell. Again, we want to make it exact, and that says that UK is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th item in our list. So we can now find out that we want the item in the second column and in the 5th row. Not very much help so far, but there's another function, index, and what index does is you can give index a table and you can tell it the row number that you want and the column number that you want, and index will give you the cell at that position in the table. So here we've used index to find the column where January is, the row where the UK is, and that then gives us the value of the cell at that intersection, which, as we can see, is our 55273. And in this cell, we actually combine that all in one go. So we had index looking at exactly the same range, and then we have our match and our second match to give us our row and our column position all in the one function. So that's index and match, finding the intersection of a row and a column. Let's have another look at index and match, and this is going the other way. So let's just insert a row here. We'll have another webinar and we'll do another VLOOKUP, and we'll have this on the 31st of March 2016, starting at 4:30, finishing at 5:30ish, and we can see that our function, our formula, identifies which course is the next one in our list. So this uses match going the other way, the -1, to look at the greatest item in our table. So this finds the next webinar that's going to take place, exactly the opposite of the previous VAT rate. This is the next date in the list. And here we combine them all into, let's just zoom in a bit here. This is, it would have helped if I pressed the right button there. Here's my plus sign. So here we can see we're combining all of that. So we're looking for our VAT rates by dates, but we're also looking for an exact match as to the type of VAT. So we have the type running across the top, we have our dates, and we have our index and match function with an approximate match for the date and an exact match for the type of VAT in order to be able to find which VAT rate to use for a particular type of invoice on a particular date. So that's some of the Excel lookups. Now, I promised right at the beginning that I'd show a way of avoiding VLOOKUP altogether. And how you get at this will depend on the version of Excel that you're using. We've been using Excel 2013, apart from some of the cosmetics. I'm not sure that anything we've done is particularly different going back to 2007. Some differences, if you go back to 2003, for example, there's no such function as SUMIFs. In 2003, it only had the SUMIF function. Otherwise, pretty much everything is the same. But this particular option is very version dependent. So in Excel 2016, the data ribbon includes a new group, the Get and Transform group. And this is, although this is new in terms of being there in the ribbon, it's not new functionality. This is actually an optional add-in called Power Query that is also available to Excel 2010 and Excel 2013. But it has to be loaded separately, then appears as a ribbon item in its own right. But in 2016, this functionality was built into the heart of Excel. And if you're used to working with databases, then you do need to understand a bit about how databases work. But it gives you an alternative way of working with lots of fairly common Excel functions. I think the main reason for using what was Power Query, what is now Get and Transform, is really to bring in external data. So you can bring in external data from a range of sources, all sorts of things here. You can see all sorts of accounting things, but also Facebook, Microsoft Exchange, from a web page, from online data sources such as Azure, from databases, from files, folders, so a whole range of data. And what Power Query enables you to do is to clean that data and shape it, manage the data, so it's in a useful format for you to then maybe use a pivot table to analyze and present. We're actually not going to use it quite in that way. What I've got here is the two tables which you hopefully will remember from a few minutes ago when we were trying to allocate categories against the codes so that we can analyze our values by category. And we're going to try and do exactly the same thing, but using the new database style tools in Get and Transform rather than using any Excel functions. So first of all, we're going to go to this table here. We've set these up as Excel tables. We can see they're tables because when we click in them, the Table Tools Design ribbon tab is available, and the table has a name, TB Structure 20 in this case. This one, TB Values 19. So we click in our structure table to start with. In our data ribbon, we're going to bring this table into our query. So we just click on From Table. This loads the Get and Transform query editor, and it just loads our table into the query editor. Now, there's all sorts of things you can do. We'll look at some of them later, but for the moment, all we want to do is just to create a connection to that table. So we just choose Only Create Connection and load, and that just creates a connection within Power Query to the information in that table. Now we go to our other table, do exactly the same thing. That brings in our table of transactions, and we've got two tables available now. We want to merge those two tables in their separate queries. So we go to Merge Queries, and this shows us our current table. We can then choose our other table that we saved just as a connection. There's our complete structure table. We then have to say how these tables are joined. They're joined by the code. So we want to link the code columns in those two tables. Now, if you understand databases, there's all sorts of different things here as to how that join should be made. We want to include all the records from the first table and any matches from the second table. And you'll see that the selection has only matched 5 out of the first 40 rows because there's only 5 items to match. We click on OK. We'll see that we now have a new column in our query, which is a table column. So this contains all the entries relevant to that row. We can click on the little icon and we can decide how we want to deal with that, whether we want to expand it to show all the individual items or not. In this case we do. We won't use the original column name as a prefix, and we only want to look at the category. So we just want to bring in the category. Click on OK, and that brings in the category. Now you remember that we only had 5 matches, and you can see those 5 matches there. Now it's quite important that we make sure that this column is sorted in ascending order, just like with our VLOOKUP, because what we can then do is to choose our category column, go to the Transform tab and choose Fill, and we can fill down, and what that will do is it will find a value, and if whatever's beneath it is a null, it will continue to fill that until it comes to the next value, and then it will carry on down. So when we click fill down, we'll see that all the sales are copied down up to and including 99 if it was there, the same with cost of sales and so on. So this performs the same sort of operation as our approximate VLOOKUP. And what we can then do is to close and load our query, and we can choose to put it on an existing sheet or on a new worksheet. Just usually would be better to put it on a new worksheet, but just so we can see what's going on, we'll stick it on an existing worksheet and we'll put it in K. Let's just see where we are. Oops. Let's put it there, K5, and that should load our query up, and if all has gone well, what we should have is the equivalent of our VLOOKUP from earlier. Now, you wouldn't want to do this for a simple lookup, but it might be valuable for more complex lookups. The advantages are you haven't had to write any complex Excel formula, you've just gone through a series of procedures. One of the disadvantages is it's a completely different way of thinking about Excel because it breaks the link we have in Excel between making a change and everything being recalculated. Unless you've turned calculation to manual in Excel, then whenever you change something, all the calculations that depend on that change are automatically recalculated. That isn't the case with using the Get and Transform tools. If you want something to change, so if I was to change a value here, let's make that minus something quite big so we can see the difference. Nothing changes here, and nothing would change here until we chose to refresh our table. So just like with a pivot table, where by default nothing changes until you refresh it, also with Get and Transform you have to refresh, but it does make it quite automatic. So for example, if I were to insert another table row here, so table rows above, let's say that we wanted to subdivide our sales, a bit more granularity, so we could maybe have Europe sales maybe, and we'll just change this one to UK sales. I could then just refresh my table and you'll see that that follows through into my query table. And you can, if you like, it's not quite the same level of automation as the automatic recalculation in a normal Excel formula, but you can in the query prompt set up the query to refresh every so many minutes. So you could make it automatic in terms of it would keep refreshing, but it won't refresh as a change is made. It will refresh every minute. So it's quite a different way of thinking about Excel, where you've got lots and lots of calculations, potentially it does work faster than using lots and lots of independent functions, and potentially you could argue it's more reliable, because if we just go back and look at our query, we've got our queries displayed here. If we edit our query, if you wanted to check what the query is doing, rather than having to check 1,000 individual formulae to make sure that they're all right, you can just go back through the steps of your query and check each step in turn to make sure that it's working as you intend. So that's using Get and Transform Power Query as an alternative to VLOOKUP, which I think brings us on to any questions. And I don't think that we've had
Unmuted.
or indeed any.
We haven't had any from our audience, Simon, though I'd like to ask you one. So from obviously the VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP we've covered, do you have any sort of best practices when using them for our audience in particular?
I think the important things to think about, obviously we discussed the need to use the correct form of VLOOKUP, and probably what I would suggest is that you always use the fourth argument, even if you were intending to do an approximate lookup, so you don't actually need the fourth argument. The discipline of always using the fourth argument will make it less likely that you'll forget to put it in when you did want to do an exact lookup. So I would always use that fourth argument. I think tables are also a good idea because Excel tables, one of the really good things about Excel tables is, this is probably good as any, is that tables will automatically expand. So where you've got a VLOOKUP, so here, rather than just have a range of cells, and if it was just a range of cells, were you to add something at the bottom or the top of the range, that wouldn't be included in your range. If you use a table and you refer to the whole table, then that range will expand or contract as you make changes to the table. So using tables with VLOOKUP makes your VLOOKUPs much more automatic. Also, the other advantage of using tables, as we saw in the example here, is that if you make a change, then by default that formula is copied to, or if you set it up, let's just set it up from scratch. So if we just set our VLOOKUP up from scratch, so VLOOKUP, look at our value, look at our table, look at our column, make it exact. Then if it's a table, when you enter it in the top row, that will automatically be copied down to all the other rows without you having to make the copy. So tables are useful. Always remember that fourth argument.
Unmuted.
Just before we leave that, the bit I did forget, that the other thing to remember when you're using VLOOKUP, and obviously you spotted my deliberate mistake there, was you must make the table range absolute if you're using a range of cells, because if you use a range of cells, as we've done there, and it's not absolute, then when it gets copied down, you'll be looking at the wrong range of cells. So if you look down here, 100 hasn't found a match. The reason for that is if we look at that, the values have changed because they're relative. So very important that you make your range here absolute, which obviously if you're using a table column will help, and then that should work properly. And while I've been droning on about that question, I think dozens more questions, or at least 2 more questions, have arrived.
We've got a few more coming. I think we've just received 3, so I think we'll take the next 3, and then after that, I'm sorry, we won't be able to take any more. So the first one, and I think this is referring to something at the start of presentation was, how did you get the flags to appear?
What a good question. That actually uses quite a complicated thing. There is somewhere where I put it. The flags are held separately somewhere, if I remember, and what we're doing here is using a camera picture. So this is a camera picture, and if you haven't used the Excel camera, what the Excel camera does is you can select a block of cells and you can take a picture of that block of cells with the camera, and you can then, let's go here, you can then paste that picture, and that's dynamic. So if we were to go back here and change something, so that should now be different and wrong. If we then go back, you'll see that that's automatically changed here. So it's a live picture of our cell. Now, usually what that does is to just use a cell reference. It's a picture of those cells, but you can replace that with a formula. Unfortunately, you can't replace it with a formula that uses a function. So what you have to do is to use the name manager to create a formula here that uses offset. So it uses offset, and what offset does, I often call it the pirate treasure map function, because you have a starting place and you move a certain number of rows and columns from your starting place. So it's like a pirate treasure map where you go 10 paces south, 5 paces east, and then start digging. So offset's sort of the same. So we build this function in here that looks at what's in C6 and then offsets that by our value in B4. So there's the value in B4. So we look at what's in C6, and if that value is 4, we offset it by 4 steps to the south, I guess. So that goes down to that flag there. So our camera picture, rather than looking at C6, looks at C7, 8, 9, 10, which gives us the flag of America. If I change that, so we're looking at different number 5, so that offsets 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, gives us our flag of South Korea.
Lovely. So one couple more to come. Next one is, can you match more than 2 criteria with values greater than 0?
Can you match more than 2 criteria with values greater than 0? I honestly don't know as I understand the question. If you when you match or when you use VLOOKUP, both match and VLOOKUP only find one item. They just come across. So if you want to apply a criteria, then you might really be looking more for something like SUMIF. So in fact, in our example here, we're sort of doing that, because what we're saying is we're saying bring in all codes that are greater than or equal to 100 but less than 200. So we could do that using SUMIF. So without doing the category bit, we could just do that using SUMIFs. So we could do equals SUMIFs. See if I get this right. The sum range, make that absolute. And the criteria range will be that our code, so we'll look at our codes this time, the code range must be, and then we want, it's got to be greater than or equal to, and use the ampersand to concatenate that with the, I forgot which cell I was in there. Let's do it for our sales. So it's got to be greater than or equal to the value in F6, and then we need to add another criteria, so a second criteria. Again, it's the code. Again, we'll make it absolute, and this time, sorry, it's a table. Don't need to make it absolute. One of the benefits of using a table. And this time it has to be less than the value in the cell below, which is 100. So that should, if I can talk and type at the same time, that should give us our value as it does there, all in the one go. So if we just put that back to sales, we should see that that is indeed sorry, just make that true, and we should be able to see that we've got the same values. So there, we've got our values there, and that's using sum ifs with 2 criteria.
Unmuted.
Lovely stuff, Simon. And the final question for today is quite a good question, actually. Is using an if statement and is error the best way to prevent #NA coming through where a match doesn't exist? That
is a brilliant question.
Muted.
For a couple of reasons. One, that it would do the trick, but that there are 2 better ways of doing it, but they're version dependent. So what you can do is, if you've got a VLOOKUP, so let's say we're looking in our table here for a value. So if I stick in a value, 150, and we want to do equals VLOOKUP, our value in our range, we want to look in the second column, and we want to make it an exact match. That will give us an NA error because there is no exact match. So we could do equals if, open brackets, is error, to see whether that returns an error. And if it does, we could do something else like put in 0. If it doesn't return an error, we then have to put in the whole of the VLOOKUP statement again to perform the calculation. So you can see there that we get our 0. Now there in, I think I can't remember whether it's 2007 or 2010. I think it's 2007. There's a new function called if error was introduced, and if error can do all of that in one go. So with if error, we just look at our function, so VLOOKUP our value in our table, look at column 2, make it exact, and if there's an error, you just put in the value, and it knows that if there isn't an error, just use the formula. So it saves you having to type the formula in twice. The problem with that is that if there was some other type of error, like you spelt VLOOKUP with 2 O's, sorry, VLOOKUP does have 2 O's, VLOOKUP with 3 O's, it wouldn't show that error, it would hide it because you're using if error, and that just looks for any error. In 2013, I think it was, a very specific error, if NA was introduced, and if NA just looks for an NA error, and it only triggers it if it's an actual NA error. So in that case, because it's not an NA error, it's an error in that you've misspelled the name, it still shows you the error. So the answer to your question is, if is error would do the trick. A better function would, or combination function would be if, and there's an is NA, there's always been an is NA, so you could do if is NA, that would be even better. You can combine them into if error, that doesn't discriminate errors, and then in 2000 and something onwards, 10 or 13, you can use if NA to make it easier and also specific.
Unmuted.
Okay, lovely, Simon. Well, everyone, that's all we've really got time for today on the question front. If you do have any more questions, do obviously drop us an email and we'll be happy to get back to you. Just wanted to say thanks for everyone to attending. Thanks again to you, Simon, for presenting today. It was a fantastic webinar. Before I leave, just a quick few words from me, just to say if you are looking to improve your spreadsheeting skills, you can obviously check out filtered.com for our Excel and Advanced Excel courses. They'll take you from Excel novice to workbook wizard, giving you all the tricks and tips needed to increase proficiency and productivity. If you have any questions, as I said, just get in touch at hello@filtered.com. We'll get back to you as quickly as we can. If you'd like to re-watch the webinar or any of our previous webinars, you'll be able to find it on our website www.learn.filtered.com/webinars. It'll be on there within about 24 to 48 hours, and you can also register for any upcoming webinars that we have there. But that's everything from me, so please join us for our next webinar, which is on April the 14th. That's personalising your learning experience. But until then, thanks for joining us and have a great evening. All right, goodbye.
Muted.